At the heart of the Third Reich's reign of terror was Adolf Hitler. But he did not act alone. Surrounding him was a loyal cadre of ruthless enforcers who turned his twisted vision into reality. Rudolf Hess, the devoted deputy; Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's commander and looter of Europe; Heinrich Himmler, the cold mastermind of the SS and the Holocaust; Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda genius who fueled a nation's hate; Reinhard Heydrich, the brutal organizer of mass murder; Martin Bormann, the shadowy manipulator behind Hitler's throne. Together they built a regime of unprecedented brutality, leaving a legacy of destruction that haunts history. This is their story. Hitler returns to a Munich that is suffering post-war. He believes Germany only surrendered because of the betrayal by left-wing Jewish politicians, which only fuels his hatred for the religion.
When Germany finally capitulates, Hitler is like millions of other servicemen, and indeed civilians, who regards the German army as being what's called stabbed in the back. And this becomes this huge myth that basically it's the people in Berlin who are responsible for the defeat and not really the Allies. And the people in Berlin are members of the left, they are Jews, they are all these sort of kind of quote-unquote evil people that Hitler and his fellow soldiers regard as having betrayed the likes of him.
This idea that the German army would have been victorious on the battlefield and that this peace treaty was signed in a way that wasn't to Germany's benefit. And of course that peace treaty was very punitive. So many articles in it making restrictions on many things, on the size of the German army, which had to be limited to 100,000, to the standing army, took away land that was German. It banned any union between Austria and Germany, and of course Hitler had a lot to say about that, among many, many other harsh provisions.
Fueled with anger and contained rage, Hitler discovers the German Workers' Party, the underdog party with only a few hundred supporters. He is engulfed in their extreme political views and wants to be involved in their manifesto.
After the war, Hitler's actually working for a small army intelligence unit, and he's actually tasked with spying on extremist small political parties in Munich. One day, Hitler, kind of incognito, goes along to this small party meeting, and it's the German Socialist Workers' Party. And he's meant to be spying on them, but actually he looks at their message and what they're saying about the way the world is and how Germany should be, and how they've been stabbed in the back by their masters in Berlin, and how the communism is on the rise, and how the Allies have utterly brought Germany to her knees with the Versailles Treaty, with those huge reparations. And Hitler looks at the message being promulgated by this party and goes, you know what? I want a part of that.
Hitler joined the DAP, the German Workers' Party, in 1919, and it was a very small and unremarkable party on the radical right of German politics, and actually one of dozens of similar parties, and quite unremarkable, until Hitler joined and really made a difference.
The party soon notices Hitler's passion when speaking and ranting about his views, and appoint him as their chief of propaganda. He shortly renames the party to the National Socialism German Workers' Party, what we now know as the Nazi Party.
Hitler's initial job for the Nazi Party is really in charge of their propaganda, and that job will later be done famously by Joseph Goebbels. But Hitler is very much aware, and this is where he's very advanced and very sophisticated for his time, that actually what's key is how you get your message out there.
Some of the important ways in which he helped the party to develop was through the initiation of a newspaper, so a party newspaper called the Volkische Beobachter, the People's Observer.
And also what Hitler is absolutely amazing at is speech making. And to begin to understand Hitler, you've really got to understand that he was the most amazing demagogue. He got on that stage, this little man, and he would sort of grow in stature. He would sort of absolutely take over the entire beer hall with his presence, and he would shout and he'd be quiet, and he would almost enter into a kind of trance, and the audiences would be mesmerised by this, and indeed they'd be mesmerised by it for decades. And this is key to how Hitler gets into power, because when he's on the stage, he becomes another figure.
Dieses Land, seine neue Mission, sie entspricht dem Gebot, das einst die deutschen Siedler aus allen Gauen des Altreichs hierher gerufen hat. Die älteste Ostmark des deutschen Volkes soll von jetzt ab das jüngste Bollwerk der deutschen Nation und damit des Deutschen Reiches sein.
Sitting in the crowd at one of the meetings was first Nazi disciple Rudolf Hess. Young and impressionable, Hess was inspired by Hitler's tyrannical rants. His admiration and respect for Hitler reached great volumes as he instantly dedicated himself to the Nazi Party.
Rudolf Hess was a very troubled man in many ways, and you only have to look at his somewhat uneven expressions whenever he's captured on film. He's got very sort of thick brows, and he looks like he's puzzling about the world in general. He was a very sort of troubled man, and he was devoted to Hitler from the very early days.
Hitler's aim is to gain power by force, not election, and quickly enlists one of his new favorite techniques: violence. He forms a military organization made up of discontented ex-soldiers who display strong patriotism, much like himself. The SA, who become known as the Stormtroopers, or the Brown Shirts. They were prepared to commit violent acts of force and terror to scare people into supporting their party, no matter the cost of their actions. His increase in popularity is noticed by World War I hero Hermann Göring. He sees the Nazi Party as leverage to gain more popularity and power for himself. After Germany surrendered to the Allies at the end of World War I, Göring became increasingly angered with his government's decision, believing the war was not lost because of the Germans, but because of cowardly left-wing politicians, the stab-in-the-back theory. Upon his return to Germany, he hears about the Nazi Party and their speaker, Hitler, and believes due to his already heroic reputation, he can grow the party and become a leader within it himself. He meets Hitler in 1921 and joins the party. Although he doesn't agree with all of the party's extremist policies, he thinks he can become powerful as a face for the party, therefore dedicates his time to campaigning with them. On the 8th of November, 1923, Hitler and his stormtroopers burst into a beer hall where the state prime minister is holding a meeting and attempt to seize power, with Hitler firing a single gunshot into the ceiling, declaring a national revolution. They then march into Munich, declaring that they will seize power, but the state police have been alerted and they open fire.
They were very quickly fired upon by the police forces, and the event was a fiasco in the end. I think that maybe the most important thing that came out of this subsequently was that Hitler realised that he would have to find a way to take his power in Germany in a legal way rather than by force.
Göring attends the putsch alongside the party and gets shot in the crossfire. He finds himself badly wounded and escapes to Austria with his wife, where he undergoes treatment for his injuries, becoming addicted to morphine in the process.
When he's recuperating from his wounds, he's given morphine, heroin, effectively. And it's that he becomes addicted to. And he develops his morphine addiction all the way through until probably his dying days at Nuremberg in 1946.
14 Nazis are killed. Hitler is wounded but manages to escape. However, 3 days later, he is arrested and charged with treason, being sentenced to 5 years in prison. This looks like the end for the underdog extremist. Whilst serving his sentence, Hitler grasps at the opportunity to turn his extremist thoughts into literature. During his time of reflection behind bars, Hitler writes Mein Kampf, a book that outlines his ideas for a Nazi political regime. With fellow Nazi Rudolf Hess taking dictation, the book becomes a manifesto for Nazi world order.
So what we've got in Mein Kampf is anti-Semitism, very virulent anti-Semitism, really strong language, and this is repeated time and again throughout that book. The other key enemy, of course, was communism or Bolshevism. So in Mein Kampf as well, we have many arguments and this kind of diatribe against this enemy of Bolshevism or communism.
It gives you a lot of insight into Hitler's state of mind. It shows you that Hitler's thinking was kind of all over the place. He would take a theory from there and a theory from there, cobble it together, and 2 and 2 would make 6. It really was intellectually a real mess.
The other thing that he did in Mein Kampf was really to create this sort of myth or this idea of an Aryan race in Germany, the master race or the Herrenvolk, and the idea that that German race should be unpolluted or untainted by inferior or foreign blood.
Basically, everybody who isn't a purebred, decent German son of the soil or honest factory worker is basically out to get him and the German people.
In Hitler's deranged universe, Jews are at the bottom of the hierarchy, referring to them as a cancer that is eating away at Germany, holding it back from greatness. He wants to eliminate them from the face of the earth. He focuses on this idea of greatness and how Germany should break its agreements to reform itself to become a superior country. He wants to break the Treaty of Versailles. They should be allowed to reclaim their territory that was lost after World War I and rebuild the army to become the most powerful in Europe. He explains his ideas behind Lebensraum, or living space, deciphering that Germany has the right to reclaim land from racially inferior people and countries. In 1925, after Hitler's early release from prison, he re-establishes the Nazi Party, using Mein Kampf as his manifesto. He enforces this idea that he has been chosen to save Germany, something he intends to do by any means necessary.
After Hitler was released from Landsberg prison in 1925, he set about refounding the Nazi Party, which had fallen into disarray, and really not just refounding it, but really trying to bring it back to strength, and indeed from strength to strength. So between 1925 and 1928, he was very much concerned to try to organize the party as best as possible, put a lot of effort and energy into canvassing, trying to get new membership, and indeed trying to get new voters.
This shocking manifesto resonated well with one individual extremist who has not yet joined the party. Heinrich Himmler has been struggling with his own anger and fury towards the current state of Germany. His approach towards others was very aggressive and destructive, being somewhat of a loner and seen as a weak individual. Little did people know he would go on to become one of the most brutal Nazi leaders in history. Himmler joins the Nazi Party shortly after Hitler's release from prison and rises steadily in the party hierarchy.
Himmler, like Hitler, looked like the very inverse of the kind of Aryan, blonde, 6'5" tall superhuman. He was a very short man, it's a weak jawline, very ugly, some pebble glasses, former chicken farmer. He looked very, very unimpressive.
Wanting to gain mass support from the German people, Hitler wants to reform the appearance of the Nazi Party, focusing on propaganda rather than violence. The establishment of a new propaganda system is created by another rising figure within the party, Joseph Goebbels. An aspiring writer with an inferiority complex, Joseph Goebbels becomes Hitler's most valued person when it comes to winning over the German public. Goebbels proves his talent producing mass propaganda for the Nazi Party, gaining them more and more public support.
Joseph Goebbels joined the Nazi Party quite early on, as did Hitler, and he became very much involved in those early years with helping the party to develop, and in particular with these techniques of propaganda and really getting these messages across to the German nation. So he was very astute, he was very shrewd in terms of trying to gain power and trying to raise the profile of the Nazi Party in its early years. Part of the way that he and Hitler did this was to use very short messages, short slogans, but to keep repeating them so that everybody knew what the Nazi Party was about.
And Hitler starts to build up his power by, trying to employ and find the right people who are going to listen to the beat of his drum and follow it. And so there's a lot of very patient politicking and a lot of persuasion, a lot of speech making. It's a very, very difficult rise to power. But Hitler knows that it can't take place through force. It has to take place from the ballot box and not the bullet.
Hitler's charisma excites the German people. His enthusiasm and dedication to Germany are exactly what the public are looking for. He encourages them to believe he can drive the country to greatness. He is winning the support of the nation. Then, in 1929, a revolutionary event that will propel Hitler's popularity off the scale, practically making him unstoppable. The Wall Street crash. The Wall Street crash leading to the Great Depression. America suffers and drags Germany down with them. American banks withdraw their loans, leaving the German economy in turmoil.
This sort of put into place a really terrible situation for Germany, economically, socially and politically, because it brought about such a crisis, and none of the governments between 1929 and the time when Hitler came into power in 1933 seemed to be able to deal with the economic crisis, and so it was political and economic turmoil.
6 million people become unemployed. Families living in poverty. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party are seeing a rise in popularity, with desperate German people being more impressionable than ever.
Extremist politics thrives on chaos, poverty, destitution, and want. And what you see as a result of the Wall Street crash and the slump in the late 20s, early 30s, are all those things in this hideous cocktail that an extremist like Hitler, and indeed don't forget that communists are also trying to get into power at the same time, and they're seeing this as an opportunity too. So let's not think that Hitler's unique, but obviously he is saying, I can solve this.
Hitler's promises for Germany and its people see a surge in the polls. By September 1930, the Nazi Party is the second largest political party in Germany. By 1933, the Nazis become the largest party in parliament, and Hitler is offered the chancellorship of a coalition government. With a God complex drilled into his mind, Hitler sees himself as the only leader of Germany. He uses democracy to build popularity, but has every intention of destroying it. With President Hindenburg growing increasingly ill, he persuades Parliament to give him emergency powers, the Enabling Act, and suspend the Constitution.
On the 30th of January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, but of a coalition government. So there were just 3 Nazi posts in that coalition government.
It's very tempting to think that when Hitler comes to power in early 1933, that his grip on power is absolutely total. In fact, he has a very uneven, shaky start. He's still quite worried about public opinion. So what he does is a mixture of passing various laws that give him more and more power, like the Enabling Act, that actually makes him immensely powerful. But also, he takes advantage of various events like the Reichstag fire, in which the German Parliament building burns down. Now, it's highly likely, but never proven, whether the Nazis actually burnt it down themselves. But certainly, in a sense, it doesn't matter. What happens is that Hitler and the Nazis took advantage of the Reichstag burning down to show that there was a communist plot against what the Nazis described as still being a democratic government. And it enabled them to seize more power, by emergency decree.
Very quickly, he turned Germany into a one-party state. So first of all, he made sure to eliminate the influence and power of the German political left, so the Socialist Party and the Communist Party for a start. were banned, but over a short amount of time as well, the Nazi Party was the only legal party too.
Eventually, in January 1933, he becomes Chancellor. Now, don't forget, Chancellor in Germany, and this still remains today, is not, at the time, the head of state. The head of state is the president. So it's the Chancellor, though, who has the real executive power.
The German people have full support for Hitler, but are clueless to the horrors that are to follow during his reign of terror. Hitler begins by establishing his ideas of an Aryan race, the pure master race of Germans, who are to follow strict reproducing laws, sterilizing people who have hereditary traits he deems unacceptable, that don't match the master race principle.
You have a lot of laws being passed, unsurprisingly, to give the Nazis more power. But also you've got a rise in the apparatus of state terror. You have a thing called the Gestapo, now completely notorious, but that stands for Secret State Police. This is a new police force. There's already the Kripo, the criminal police, but this is a new type of policeman. It's a policeman who is in plain clothes. It's a policeman who recruits informers, on every block, on every street, in every block of flats, in order for the people to effectively police themselves. And of course, this becomes an incredibly important part of the Nazi apparatus.
In May 1933, Goebbels arranges the burning of all un-German books at the Opera House in Berlin, an indication that the Nazis are taking control of everything. He gets control of the media entirely, controlling all aspects of the press. Radio, theatres, films and television, literature, music and the fine arts. Nazism is everywhere.
Joseph Goebbels is the Nazi propaganda minister. He is married to a very striking blonde woman called Magda. Now, Magda has been married before to a very wealthy German industrialist, but she eventually gets divorced and marries Joseph Goebbels, who was a real Casanova, actually. Even though he was short, club-footed, and not an attractive man, he had a lot of sexual conquests.
Magda was very good for the Nazi Party, and when Goebbels introduced her to Hitler, Hitler got on very well with her and sort of could see the advantages and encouraged them to get married.
Adolf Hitler absolutely adored Magda Goebbels and thought that she was the kind of perfect Nazi woman. And she was blonde, and she was, sort of vivacious, and she was absolutely devoted to Hitler. She absolutely adored him. Essentially, they were in love with each other. She and Goebbels get married as a way of both of them to get close to Hitler. So Hitler goes and visits the Goebbels couple, uninvited, will spend entire evenings with them until the small hours, chatting away. Magda loves that attention, Hitler loves that attention from Magda, and Goebbels is of course jealous, but he also loves the fact that he's got the Führer in his living room. So he's right at the heart of power.
Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda are seen as the perfect German family to set an example for the German people.
She was very well bred and very refined and elegant, always dressing very much in very beautiful, fashionable clothes. And this kind of image that she was projecting then was of the image of the mother of the Reich, because she and Joseph had 6 children. She had been to a finishing school. Her father was sort of from quite a high echelon of society, and so she knew about etiquette. She knew about table manners. She knew how to dress. She knew about society. Whilst the Nazis were this kind of upstart organisation, and we've sort of seen that a lot of the kind of brown shirt activities was about violence and sort of the street and all of those kinds of things, then the association that Magda gave was this kind of social acceptability and the idea of the Nazis getting an entree into sort of upper middle class or even aristocratic society.
Hitler plans to eliminate all other opposition, including those on his own side. He no longer wants to be seen as a violent party and plans to wipe out his own paramilitary organization, the SA. Heinrich Himmler has established his own force of elite bodyguards for Hitler, the SS. They are tasked with wiping out the SA entirely.
Heinrich Himmler is one of the most pivotal figures in the Third Reich, and he's most famous for being the head of the SS. Now, that is the Nazi elite armed force. It's not part of the army. It's originally called the Schutzstaffel, the protection squad that's just there to protect Hitler. And what Himmler does from, almost from the beginning is to build the SS up into a state within a state, because by the height of Nazi power, Himmler is in charge of an organization that has a kind of civil side to it, an administrative side to it, which is huge and has fingers in so many pies, and also the Waffen-SS, the armed SS, which is there to help fight the war. And its troops are notorious for being some of the most sort of kind of evil and deadly troops, as part of the war.
On the 30th of June 1934, a night that became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler took the opportunity to really get rid of any opposition within the Nazi Party. And really, I think he was looking for an opportunity to really eliminate those who seemed to tarnish somehow the reputation of the party.
What he's very worried about is his relationship with the army. Now, the army and the armed forces generally do not like paramilitary organisations, and specifically the brown shirts, the SA, the stormtroopers. Now, these have been kind of on Hitler's side for a very long time in the run-up to power, but now he's in power. He doesn't need a paramilitary force because he's got this thing called the actual armed forces. He's got a navy, an air force, an army under his direct control, and the generals, they don't like the stormtroopers. They see them as a threat to them. They see them as a rival military force, and they're trying to convince Hitler, look, you've got to get rid of the SA, the stormtroopers.
There was this idea that the stormtroopers, so the SA, led by Ernst Röhm, were somehow overstepping the mark. This idea that they were going to have a second revolution, and this was something that Hitler absolutely did not want. So he wanted the party to be much more respectable, and to really get rid of any kind of rough and tumble, let's say, that the stormtroopers still represented.
Becoming known as the Knight of the Long Knives, he uses his SS organization, considered his personal bodyguards, to carry out this task. The SS didn't have much of a reputation at this point, therefore were no threat to the image of the Nazi Party.
This is seen as the ultimate sort of expression of Hitler's power, that he can even turn upon his old allies in order to consolidate his own power and in order to get the army directly where he wants it. Where's that? Under his thumb.
This was considered a pivotal moment in Hitler's rise to power. Himmler proves his worth to Hitler by carrying out these assassinations carefully and with ease. He is also assisted by a man who Hitler later nicknamed the Man with the Iron Heart, Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich joined the SS in 1931, working closely with Himmler. He soon gets promoted to take charge of the Gestapo and the criminal police forces.
Heydrich was one of those Nazis who truly, even today, makes one's blood run cold. You just have to look at the man to see his evil. He just looks like this nasty piece of work, and boy was Heydrich a nasty piece of work. Himmler goes, well, why don't you join this unit, this new unit called the Sicherheitsdienst, the security service, which is the SS espionage service, if you like, that's going to spy on enemies within the Third Reich and enemies abroad. And it's Heydrich who turns the SD into one of the most redoubtable units of the whole Nazi regime, and will gain enormous amounts of power, because it's the SD, actually, that ends up carrying out the Holocaust.
In August 1934, President Hindenburg dies, and Hitler unites the chancellorship and presidency into one role for himself, Führer of Germany.
He's able to take on the role of both president and chancellor and kind of create this new role for himself, and that is the role of Führer, the German word for leader. That is a fascist term, be in no doubt. This is a kind of new form of governance that Germany now has. Other parties are banned. The only party allowed is the Nazi Party. This has become a totalitarian state, and Hitler can say to the German people, you voted for it. It's a con, and it's a con that worked.
With his support from the German people confirmed, Hitler begins to enforce some of his tyrannical policies. In February 1935, Hitler orders Hermann Göring to establish the Luftwaffe, a German air force, which once again defies the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. 1 month later, he rearms the army with the aim of completely undoing the treaty, uniting all the German people who are delighted with his dedication to their nation.
He does everything that the Versailles Treaty tells him not to do. He remilitarizes and marches into various zones where he's not allowed to be, such as the Rhineland. And he also starts building up his armed forces, secretly at first, and then blatantly. All this soon becomes really blatant. And the Allies, such as the British and the French, they just look at it, and what do? They do nothing.
1935 sees the introduction of the Nuremberg Laws. Hitler is beginning to convince the German people that the Jews are to blame for Germany's previous struggles. Marriage between Jews and German people becomes illegal. Jewish people are stripped of their citizenship and all their civil rights.
So we know that from as early as Hitler's writings in Mein Kampf that he was personally anti-Semitic. And what we see once the Third Reich comes into power is his personal anti-Semitism translated into state policy. So from the very earliest days and months of the Third Reich, there were many different measures, legal measures taken against the Jews, and also illegal measures as well.
Just as he had promised in Mein Kampf, Hitler is treating the Jews in Germany as an internal enemy. So what you see are laws stripping Jews of their German citizenship. You see awful things like Jews not being allowed to go to swimming pools, because if a Jew swam in a public swimming pool, the water would have to be drained because the Jew had dirtied the water. So you can see that you've got this sort of awful both political and cultural exclusion of the Jewish community.
And if it wasn't enough to completely demoralize the Jewish population, Hitler takes things one step further. The Night of Broken Glass in 1938 sees the destruction of over 7,000 Jewish shops, and 400 synagogues are burnt to the ground.
When we get to 1938, we come to quite a key moment in the history of Nazi anti-Semitism. We come to the night of the 9th to 10th of November 1938, to a night known as Reichskristallnacht, Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass.
The Nazis just literally set fire to synagogues everywhere. They smash up Jewish shops and Jews are killed.
Near on 100 people were killed in the course of the night, and between 20 and 30,000 German Jews were taken to concentration camps.
This absolutely horrific destruction, slaughter, violence carried out by the state against its own people. It showed the world what Hitler was. He was effectively a gangster and a murderer.
Himmler and Heydrich bring their evil minds together once more to orchestrate this terrible night of violence. Heydrich orders the arrests of thousands of Jews by the Gestapo, and with Himmler's influence has them all sent to concentration camps. Himmler established the first Nazi concentration camp in Dachau, indicating he had no issues with bringing harm to the Jews, as he considers them a vermin within Germany. Heydrich is already establishing the idea of murdering all Jews.
It's the SS men doing not only the exterminations, but they're also the ones who are appropriating wealth from the Jews and all the other slaves being used, and appropriating all the stuff that they own, and also selling this workforce to big German industries who are paying for its use. And all that is going to the pockets of the SS. So the SS becomes incredibly rich as an organisation. And it's also running police forces, you name it. It is, as I say, it's the state within a state. And the man at the top of it is Heinrich Himmler.
30,000 Jews are arrested and sent to concentration camps, where they will see out the rest of their lives in torture and unlawful conditions. The German people are unaware of the inhumane treatment that will take place in these camps, but are beginning to realize the severity of Hitler's anti-Semitism.
After the Night of the Broken Glass, the situation for Germany's Jews just got worse and worse from then until the war, and of course during the war as well. They were impoverished, they were made to pay a big atonement fine. Money was taken from them in order to pay for this calamity that they'd allegedly brought upon themselves. There's no doubt about the centrality of anti-Semitism to Hitler's worldview. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But what he seemed to be trying to do was sort of stay in the shadows, so that when we get a pogrom like this, that the public, the German public and the population were quite affronted by it. I think he managed to maintain his popularity during this time. First of all, because he was staying in the shadows of more unpopular policies. And there was certainly that sentiment among the German population, because of this myth that surrounded the Führer, that, well, if there were unpleasant things going on or policies that they didn't like, all of those sort of more difficult aspects of the Third Reich, then somehow that Hitler couldn't know about it, that he wasn't associated with it, that it had to be one of the other leaders. It can't have been him. If only the Führer knew, this wouldn't be happening.
Alongside this, Hitler is keeping to his promises made in Mein Kampf. Factories are helping to build up the German army to become the most advanced in Europe. This will all support Hitler's plans for Lebensraum, taking back the land he claims they deserve. With each area they take back, Britain and France are still all talk. Nobody is opposing Hitler's army and their storm on attaining land.
More far-sighted people in Britain and France are sort of going, well, where's this going to end? You know, because if you keep giving someone something, they're going to keep wanting more, because that's human nature. That's what Hitler did.
However, learning of his plans to invade Poland, the Allied countries make it clear they will declare war, but Hitler ignores their threat, as they've never acted before. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler launches an attack on Poland, underestimating the start of World War II. For the first time, foreign leaders become aware of how insane Hitler really is. Hitler divulges this concept of blitzkrieg, a lightning war, to his German public.
In September 1939, Hitler invades Poland, along with Stalin. Stalin also, Soviet Russia, also invades Poland at the same time. But what the world remembers is the fact that Hitler invaded Poland, and a couple of days later, the British declare war on Germany.
Hitler himself claims it to be a war of racial annihilation. No mercy is to be upheld. Within just 6 weeks, Poland is crushed by the German army, and tens of thousands of Poles executed.
The German population, because of Hitler's popularity, and even though they had experienced the horrors of the First World War and the trench warfare of the First World War, and all of the shell shock and everything that went with it, because he was so popular, they might not have been delighted to go to war in September 1939, but they went along with it.
In 1940, Hitler's all-powerful army rules over Denmark, Norway, Holland and Belgium, and eventually crushes France with their number of tanks. Germany is untouchable.
Really, one of the high points of Hitler's popularity was, the image of the Nazis taking over Paris. All of these attacks were very sort of quick and easy victories for the Nazis, and they just fed Hitler's success and popularity.
These successes are only fueling Hitler's ego, which leaves him with no hesitation to invade Stalin's Russia, despite their previous peace pact. Hitler enthuses his army with these ideas that nobody is superior to the Aryan race. Therefore, all means of violence and mass murder will be tolerated. With the German people feeling positive and patriotic, focusing on the war, Hitler can now enforce his most brutal horrors of the Third Reich.
The Nazi regime absolutely hated the Jews and wanted to get rid of them from the very beginning. So we see that with some of the earlier policies, but as we get into the wartime period, of course, the policies become more and more radicalized, more and more extreme. So this idea, essentially the Nazis created this idea of a Jewish question or a Jewish problem that needed a solution. And throughout the course of the Third Reich, they put into place a variety of different measures to try to deal with their so-called Jewish problem.
Hitler's plans for the Jews, and when he decided to slaughter them, still remain a topic of a lot of historical controversy, because there is no piece of paper that says kill all Jews, signed A. Hitler. But I think that what is absolutely clear is that in conversation he would have said to his top leaders, we need to start killing these people. Hitler was smart enough to know this shouldn't be on a piece of paper. The initial idea is that the Jews are rounded up into ghettos, and from those ghettos they can then be sent to concentration camps where they can be worked to death. And you see these camps all over occupied Poland and all over Germany itself. Suddenly, around the time of Barbarossa, 41, it starts to get actually eliminationist. And you have what's called Action Reinhardt, in which you got the establishment of 4 actual death camps in what was occupied Poland.
Special death squads are sent in to murder the Jews, the victims being made to dig a trench, then forced to stand inside, waiting to be shot. Groups are continuously sent into the trench to die until it is full of bodies. With a shocking 1.5 million Jews shot in this process. With Hitler's focus being turned towards the extermination of the racially impure, war efforts are lacking. Rudolf Hess notices the Führer is preoccupied and decides to take matters into his own hands. He has been losing his influence on Hitler. Once being known as the Deputy Führer, he has now been pushed so far out of the circle, he goes by unnoticed. In a last drastic attempt to get back into the circle, he decides to bring the continuing military struggle between Germany and the Allies to an end by means of a peace pact.
He carries out this absolutely extraordinary mission, takes off from a Messerschmitt 110 in Augsburg and flies to Scotland, obviously, where he parachutes out to land on the land of the Duke of Hamilton, who he thinks is a friend of his. And he says, I'm here to basically, forge a peace deal. That, if you allow Nazi Germany to have a free hand in Europe, we'll allow the British Empire and British colonies a free hand, and for Britain to maintain her influence all over the world. And of course, this is just complete nonsense. Churchill by this stage is in no mood to start listening to what is clearly a semi-deranged individual. And he just remains in prison.
Once Hitler hears of his plan and capture in Britain, he declares Hess has committed treason, and he is rejected from the Nazis. The exile of Hess opened doors for a shadowy figure in the inner circle. Martin Bormann was initially chief of staff to Rudolf Hess, but after his capture in Britain, Hitler promotes him to head of the party chancellery. Bormann is seen as a secretive but extremely powerful presence in the Third Reich, having the most access and contact with Hitler. He controlled all acts of legislation and party promotions, as well as drawing up the Führer's schedule and appointments calendar. Bormann had the power to decide who was allowed to see Hitler and when. This caused him to be hated by fellow members of the inner circle, but they knew they had to maintain a civil relationship with him in order to get access to Hitler.
Martin Bormann is one of the most enigmatic and cryptic figures of the Third Reich. He was one of the kind of old fighters, as it was called. He was kind of there from the very early days. Very loyal Nazi, but always in the shadows. He was head of what was called the Chancellery, and as a result, he actually had the kind of keys to Hitler, if you liked. If you want to go and speak to Hitler, you got to go through Bormann. It doesn't matter who you are, everyone's got to go through Bormann. And so that gives him enormous power, because if he can say you can and you can't, you've got to curry favour with him. And of course, in any dictatorship, whoever's the nearest to the dictator is going to have the most power.
In secret, Hitler's inner circle are experimenting with other forms of mass murder to be deemed more efficient. This is known as the final solution. Reinhard Heydrich chairs a meeting known as the Wannsee Conference, in which leading Nazis discuss ways in which the Jews can be eliminated economically and efficiently.
The Wannsee Conference really was that moment, a kind of very important moment in the evolution of Nazi anti-Semitic policy and in what we call the final solution, because this was the moment that both retrospectively sanctioned what had already been going on, these experiments at the end of 1941 and really set in place then the momentum for the establishment and running of these death camps. And there were 6 of those, all of them on Polish soil through the height of the war.
A secret department, known as T4, is instructed to find a way to kill as many as possible, quickly and quietly, out of the knowledge of the German public.
By the time we get to the end of 1941, the Nazis had already put into place this Action T4, which was actually the extermination of the German asylum population. So Action T4 between 1939 and 1941 had used poisonous gas to kill Germany's mentally and physically ill population. And that was something like 70,000 adults and maybe up to 6,000 children and teenagers.
It really was the most repellent form of kind of Nazi quote-unquote medicine that you could imagine. It is basically chopping people out of life. You're killing them. You're killing children with epilepsy. You're killing people who've got mild spinal deformities. You're killing people who've even got stutters, because you're saying they're genetically weak and we don't want them if we're going to make this strong, blonde, Aryan race full of perfect superhumans.
When the truth about the killing emerges, German people become distressed that their friends and family members may be targeted. They begin to protest and express their dismay towards the horrors they have just uncovered. Hitler quickly withdraws the program, realizing he may have gone too far, realizing the limit of what the German people would accept.
And it happened in secret, in these kind of horrific hospitals and castles. And these are the sites of some of the worst murders carried out by the Nazis. So it was a repellent program, and the German people knew it when they found out about it. And when it was really appreciated by the public, it was stopped. So it shows you that Hitler was sensitive to public opinion and would go with public opinion when it went against him.
He depicts that future killings needed to be well hidden, and he shouldn't be associated with it. He must fool the German people to portray a kind and caring persona as their Führer, not wanting to lose support from his country. He never personally signs a document for these killings again, keeping his own image in the clear. However, all the other Nazis act in his name, organizing this destruction themselves.
Hitler keeps his public image very clean. People are aware that bad things are happening to Jews and they're being deported, but they're not precisely sure. But you do see glimpses of it, because sometimes you get German parents telling their children, if you don't behave, you'll go up the chimney like Jews. So clearly that suggests there was a sort of kind of knowledge that maybe something like that was going on. But also a lot of German families were more worried about the fate of their own sons, fathers and uncles fighting, especially on the Eastern Front, which is turning into a bloody bloodbath.
Hitler moves the killings from Germany with the idea they must happen as far away as possible. Building a network of death camps in Poland, this was the beginning of the final solution.
The Germans were involved, in their own experience of the war, preoccupied with their own difficulties, and in a sense then, once the Jews weren't there anymore, they were sort of out of their frame of reference and just not in their thoughts.
Heinrich Himmler is tasked with creating death camps, elimination rooms where thousands can be executed at once. He becomes responsible for the murders and slaughtering of millions of Jews, a total atrocity.
He was responsible for the Holocaust because, it was the SS largely who carried it out. And when he went to go and kind of witness a slaughter, some brains were splattered upon his coat and it caused him to vomit. He never, this is the man responsible for it and he can't cope with it. I'm not saying it's desirable that he should have coped with it, but it just shows you that he didn't actually have the personal appetite for butchering people himself and got other people to do it. In many ways, he was a coward.
Jews from all over Europe are transported to these camps, unaware of the inhumane scenarios they are about to face. Horror, screams, mass murder, an unimaginable scene of death and destruction. millions of Jews were murdered because of one man's horrific desire for a racially pure nation.
Death camps, all of those were on Polish soil, so they were out of the immediate frame of sight or reference of the Germans. So again, in some way, they were happening elsewhere and not really in their immediate field of vision.
These are places that are places of deep, deep horror, because you didn't go there to work, you went there to die. And you would arrive, and within 30 minutes, you'd be dead. Treblinka, for example, is no bigger, if you visit it, than a football stadium, the size of a football pitch. And in that very small area, around 850,000 men, women and children were gassed. It's just the most horrific thought if you ever visit a place like that. Auschwitz, again, a very huge, iconic place associated with the Holocaust, of course, famously where 1 million Jews were put to death, many of whom were gassed on arrival. But it also was a concentration camp rather than just an extermination camp. So it has these two horrific roles. And don't forget, Auschwitz and places like this, they're huge. Auschwitz is 3 camps spread over about 10 miles. I mean, these are factories of death. There's no doubt about it.
Reinhard Heydrich, the man who would have murdered millions if he had not been stopped. Operation Anthropoid, 2 men trained in Britain to carry out the planned assassination of Heydrich. On May 27, 1942, the men approached the car taking Heydrich through Prague's Kobylisy district, in which he was traveling without an armed escort. Unfortunately, the operation didn't quite go as planned, as the gun jammed within meters of the car. Quick thinking led to a grenade being thrown towards the vehicle and exploding inside, wounding Heydrich badly. He was taken to hospital, but after refusing to let any non-German surgeon operate on him, he died several days later of septicemia. All members of the Nazi Party were required to be a part of the final solution, as it was genocide on a mass scale, therefore needed mass participation. By the end of 1944, 6 million Jews have been murdered upon his approval, due to his own horrific ideals and regime. Hitler is absorbed with the focus on creating a pure race. He is losing the war he created. The inferior nations around him are now closing in on his territory. The war is closing in on Berlin, reducing Hitler and a circle of his closest, most trusted Nazis into a bunker under the ruins of his chancellery. Hitler's image of an all-powerful dictator is slowly decreasing as his tremor gets worse.
Once the Red Army came into German territory in 1945, then Hitler's position as this infallible ruler and leader really not only became to be called into question, but really came to its end. Because the Soviet troops were very vengeful, they were retaliating for all the terrible brutalities and atrocities that the Nazis and the German army had put into place in Soviet territory. What it meant was that they were coming closer and closer on their journey westwards to Berlin, and eventually Hitler and a very small inner circle around him had to retreat to his bunker, his underground bunker.
During the last days of his life, Hitler is seen as a demented dictator, battling to rule what had become a phantom Reich, with an army who were no longer listening to his requests. He believed Germany had failed him and no longer deserved his power or ruling. He wanted the whole country to be torn down with him.
This is a war brought about by Hitler, and this is a war that Hitler has fought for too long, and he's fighting it to the death. And he's fighting it to the death of the people who he supposedly loves. And he no longer loves them by the end of the war. And he says that basically the German people don't deserve him, the German people don't deserve Germany, and everybody should fight to the death because basically, they don't deserve to be alive because they failed him. Classic narcissistic thinking. The world is for him, and he's not there for the world.
One by one, his inner circle begin to abandon him as they realize what will happen to them at the end of the war. Goering has already retired as much as he is permitted. Retreating to his estate with his wife, he was also framed in a scandal claiming he was attempting to take over the Führer's powers in the final days of the war.
he became this kind of drug-addled, alcoholic whale of a man who other Nazis would laugh at and not take seriously and saw him as an impediment. So actually, by the end of the war, he's this joke figure.
Goering wrote a letter to Hitler offering to relieve Hitler of his duties and act in his place, as he had believed the Führer was encircled and helpless in Berlin. This was a reasonable act, seemingly, as Hitler had named him to be the political heir. However, scheming Martin Bormann saw this as an opportunity to wipe out another one of his threats within the inner circle. He intercepted the letter before it reached Hitler himself. He presented the letter to the Führer as though Goering was attempting to commit treason. Hitler issued a telegram to Goering and told him that he had committed high treason and gave him the option to resign his offices in exchange for his life. Rumors are indicating that Himmler has plans to succeed Hitler and continue running the Nazi Party. He has already made negotiations with the enemies to release Jewish prisoners from the concentration camps to freedom via Switzerland. Once Hitler finds out about Himmler's independent plans, he strips him of all offices and orders his arrest. Only his loyal mistress Eva Braun stands beside him, continuing to fuel his demented fantasy that he is still the greatest man in the world. Eva Braun was Hitler's best-kept secret. Meeting him aged 17, she was young, impressionable, and easily led. Eva was a very mysterious character, always being in the background of all affairs and rarely seen in public. The normality of their relationship was unclear. The 30th of April, 1945. Hitler comes to terms with the fact that Germany is losing the war and is beyond repair. He hadn't made a public appearance or speech in months. His victories are long gone, needing a mixture of drugs to keep him sane.
Hitler's last days in the Führer bunker under the Reich Chancellery in the centre of Berlin, are a kind of terrible end of a Shakespearean tragedy, as the thunder of Russian artillery all around them, and they're deep inside this sort of concrete underground fortress. Everybody's sort of kind of going mad, and especially Hitler.
On this day, he finally agrees to marry Eva Braun, just hours before their suicide. The pair tie the knot, with what's left of Hitler's loyal advisors as witness.
Finally, after many years of being Hitler's long-term partner, Hitler married Eva Braun that night. It was to be a very short-lived marriage because 2 days later, they both committed suicide together.
He hands her a cyanide capsule and he holds his pistol. The pair commit suicide together, leaving Germany in ruins. Hitler would rather die than flee Germany and be seen as weak.
Their bodies are burnt. In this great kind of almost like a sort of Viking pyre, like a Viking longship going up.
Europe's most evil dictator is dead. Just over a week later, Germany surrenders. As the death camps are uncovered, everyone learns the horrors of the Nazi regime.
On the 7th of May 1945, Germany surrendered. And once that had happened, the atrocities of the Nazi regime came to popular attention.
Ultimately, when it was shown quite how evil Nazism was and the German people fully appreciated it, then, yes, the opinion of Hitler was not quite so positive.
Joseph and Magda Goebbels are devastated at the suicide of their beloved Führer. Magda does not want to raise her children in a world without Hitler and the Third Reich.
And if you want to see the ultimate expression of this twisted, bizarre, dark, horrific love, if you like, it's the fact that they both kill themselves to follow Hitler into the afterlife. And they kill their own children in the bunker, poison all 6 children, because a world without Hitler and a world without Nazism is no place for their kids. That's how much they adored Hitler.
After the discovery of the horrific secrets of the Nazi regime, remaining important party members were arrested and set to face the judge in the Nuremberg trials. Rudolf Hess was brought back to Germany after his prison sentence in Britain and found guilty at the trials, being given a life sentence. Heinrich Himmler was captured but committed suicide before he could be tried. Hermann Göring was sentenced to the death penalty but committed suicide in his cell by cyanide the night his execution was ordered, cheating the hangman. As for Martin Bormann, he disappeared shortly after Hitler's death. There were rumors that he had escaped and was living in hiding somewhere in the world. He was indicted at the Nuremberg trials and found guilty. The downfall of the Third Reich was the inevitable end of Hitler's inner circle. And although many of these monsters evaded trial for their horrendous crimes, there is no doubt the ultimate justice awaited them all.